Good morning. Welcome to Full Scottish, an hour-long programme on Scottish politics and culture. Our guests today include Joy Dunlop, who's a Gaelic singer and a Mod Gold medalist, and author and playwright Peter Arnott. We'll be discussing Brexit, we'll be discussing Trump, we'll be discussing the Gaelic language plan, and we'll be hearing some great music. So without further ado, on with the show. Hi, welcome again. So, we're going to open the show just now with a discussion, I guess, on fairly momentous events this week on Brexit. We've had Holyrood and Westminster unable to reach agreement, and we now seem to be approaching what some commentators are saying the end game in terms of whether or not there is some accommodation to be made between Westminster and Holyrood in terms of the transfer of powers. Peter?
Well, it seems to be. It seems that this is very dramatic stuff, or it should be, but somehow, bizarrely, it isn't.
Yes.
I've been finding in the press and in commentary that there have been very few people have seem to have picked up on the momentous nature of what has just happened to devolution. Devolution's just been cancelled. I don't know if people have noticed this. But what has happened is that the Westminster Parliament, in the Brexit enabling bill, which is called the Continuity Bill, and then in Clause 11, subsection 30, paragraph 4, our paragraph moment.
How do you know all this detail? You're the only person apart from Mike Russell.
Well, that's maybe exactly the problem. Because what this clause said, it is an absolute masterpiece of parliamentary double talk. In this one clause, it says that the Scottish Parliament will be consulted on various areas which we had thought, in the context of Brexit, which were in devolved areas like agriculture, fishing, fracking, all that kind of area. Now, we had thought that all this was going to be devolved from the European jurisdiction, where it is now, to the Scottish jurisdiction, because these are devolved powers.
Yes.
But this, of course, is not going to happen. The British government argues that there needs to be a unitary British approach. But what they've come up with, rather than ask for our consent, for the consent of the Scottish Parliament, as is the norm, and when the British Parliament makes a policy that affects a devolved area, the norm is that the consent of the Scottish Parliament, the Welsh Assembly, the Northern Ireland Assembly is sought for this. But in the case of the powers coming back from Brussels, there's been this clause I mentioned. I'm going to do it again. I'm going to show off again.
Please do. Let me to check and make sure you do this exactly the same numbers.
If I'm wrong, it's section 30, paragraph 4 of clause 11 of the Continuity Bill, and what this says is, if the Scottish Parliament consents to the changes Westminster makes, that will be taken as consent. So far, so legal.
Absolutely.
Then it says, if the Scottish Parliament does not consent, this will be taken as consent. If the Scottish Parliament is silent, it will be taken as consent.
There's not really very many options there.
And then subsection C says, if the Scottish Parliament positively refuses consent, passes a motion, that would be, in Holyrood, to say, we refuse to accept this, that will be taken as consent. So basically,
pattern emerging.
Yes, there is a pattern emerging. And what this is basically is that for 7 years, we are being asked to give up the limited amount of sovereignty that we've got. We are being when it comes to these particular areas. Now, why Ian McWhirter in the Herald this morning has actually written a column. Why this isn't screaming headlines? Why this isn't the Liberals and the Labour Party designed devolution. They made it happen. The Scottish National Party stood back from it. Originally, they stood back from it, saying, "Well, it's not independent, so it's not the real thing."
Yeah.
So, why isn't the town on fire? And yes, of course, it's dry parliamentary procedure, but it's really simple. What they've said is, if we refuse to agree, they're going to take that as agreement anyway. That's really straightforward, and it seems to me a really straightforward principle upon which you could, in defending the devolution settlement, you could advance the national debate. But almost no one's doing it.
Joy, are you finding yourself getting angry at this latest twist in the Brexit epic?
I think I'm angry, but in some ways I'm not surprised, because this to me sums up Brexit in whole, that nothing was properly explained, nothing was properly understood, and I think folk have not picked up on the subtleties from the beginning. So in a lot of ways I'm not very surprised that this is happening, because this has been the pattern from the start. Nothing was ever clear. Nobody understood the proper picture, and the media in particular, I don't feel ever quite got into it. I think they just assumed at the beginning, oh, it would never happen anyway, so we don't really need to bother with it in Scotland in particular. And then once it did happen, everybody was scrabbling to understand, well, what does this really mean? What effect is this going to have on the rest of us? So although I'm furious in many ways, I feel I've also resigned myself to this is how it's going to go, because that's what it's been like since the beginning.
From the very beginning, even before the referendum itself, there was a kind of, I felt, a lack of engagement with the whole issue, really. And I think I blamed, as much as the Leave side, I blamed the Remain side for failing to find the language to articulate the whole issue in a way that people would understand and connect with, and therefore get. But then that's the nature of Europe itself. I mean, when I was working in newspapers to try and write articles about Europe that people would be interested in and involved, it was very difficult.
Well, it's clauses and subclauses, unfortunately. And here I was losing you viewers.
Yes. No, come back.
By going through a clause, but this is the stuff of which constitutions are made.
And it's not good enough, I think, just to say, oh, it's quite dry language.
No.
It's not the most accessible. Somebody's got to go in there and break through that, because I think that folk have been blindsided by, in some ways, information that is in plain sight, but they don't understand it. I mean, who's going to understand a clause if you're not a politician?
Sure, absolutely.
I suppose as well that, I mean, while in principle, clearly the powers coming back to Holyrood is a matter of prime importance, but actually, since nobody actually knows what those powers are, they're thinking, well, in principle, I don't think it's a good idea that they go to Westminster, but what actual difference does it make?
Yes, well, I think we'll find in the course of the next 7 years. I mean, if it goes, I mean, it's still got to get through the Supreme Court. There's still going to be a court case between the Scottish Parliament and the Westminster Parliament. And actually, the result is not as certain as Theresa May and company seem to think. So all kinds of things could happen, and they will remain esoteric, as you say. But what will happen is that if, let's say, something like this consent bill goes through, then over the next 7 years, one issue after another will start coming up, and they'll be important. And people will say, "Oh, hang on a minute.
Why didn't we know this was happening?"
And then we'll say, "Well, you did."
Absolutely. Because when it comes down to it, we've got two parliaments here, and there is, I suppose, a fight going on for supremacy about which parliament actually is the one that counts in Scotland. And most of us, I think, most people would accept that it's the Scottish Parliament, and that can't just be just ignored by Westminster. But I don't know why there's not. There's anger in principle, but not in action.
I think yes, people are. I think people assume that the Scottish Parliament. I mean, this is in a sense the trap that the SNP administration are in, is that they're assumed to be in power when actually they're not. They're assumed to have influence over. Although there have been developments, as we'll maybe talk about later on, the Social Security bill this week, but they are not actually in a position of being able to make decisions. But I don't know. It strikes me as this is only our local branch of the surreal when it comes to Brexit, because we're also in a situation where we have people who argued vociferously for Brexit to happen, who have made no actual preparations of any kind for it to actually happen. So that in Dover, there's nothing. The Dutch are building infrastructure to prepare for Brexit. The British aren't. It's supposed to be happening in the spring of 1919, or the transition periods. But it's entirely possible that if the transition period isn't agreed, then we crash out next spring, less than a year from now, and there are no preparations of any kind that are being made. So in other words, even the Brexiteers are acting as if it's not actually going to happen. So perhaps it's not surprising that ourselves in Scotland, at one remove from the bear pit of Westminster, are also reacting to something. This is something vaguely happening over there. or not happening at all.
Although we voted, I mean, clearly, obviously, Scotland voted to remain in Europe.
Yeah.
What is it about Europe, do you think, that people vote for remaining in, but yet actually don't engage with it emotionally? Do you find that?
I think the whole issue in general, I just don't think folk understand particularly what does Europe mean, what does the European Union mean, how are we a part of that? And going back to the whole Brexit issue, there seemed to be two sides. There was people who were very much for remaining, and then there was the other side who not necessarily wanted to leave, but I think wanted something to change. They blindly voted for change because they felt that the situation wasn't working as it was, and there was definitely, well, it can't be worse than this. This was the argument, and I think now, once Brexit was agreed, then not only people, but actually politicians didn't really know what that meant. They didn't know how that was going to happen. And actually it's not been as easy as everybody was explained it was going to be. I think that's part of it, is nobody really knows what to grasp onto. So,
and it's
because
been
there's
going
nothing,
on
it's been on so long, it's been going on like
and
this.
actually nothing has happened yet.
Yeah, and exactly, nothing's happened. I mean, I now remember the kind of the quintessential conversation with the taxi driver that one has.
Yes.
This was actually taking my son to hospital with a broken arm, so it was doubly kind of odd. The taxi driver.
You talked about Brexit clearly.
It was just before the vote, and the taxi driver was obviously very afraid that my son was going to throw up in the back of his taxi, which is a legitimate fear, I would say. And so he began talking about Brexit, and he was a man in his 60s who was always, or maybe even older, but he was retired, and he was basically he told me he was going to vote leave in order to bring back full employment on the Clyde, because there had been full employment on the Clyde before we joined the European Union. So therefore, what he was voting for was a TARDIS.
Yeah. Although those other people that you talk to and you ask them what their main issue it was, and they say it's immigration, and you say, where are you worried about immigrants coming from? And they name a long list of countries, none of which is in Europe, and you think,
And also there's an awful lot of people who were saying, well, the European Union isn't working. So instead of trying to fix it or work out what wasn't working, it was, well, let's just drop it.
Yeah.
And with no safeguarding, with no understanding, well, what's going to take its place? How are we going to fit into the world?
So this kind of existential protest against the way things are.
Yes.
But then again, we in Scotland should take a little pause at this and wonder how much of the yes vote in 2014 was exactly the same. How much of the yes vote in 2014 was saying something's got to change.
Yeah.
And this looks like change.
This looks like as good a route as any.
And so maybe psychologically it was a similar thing, as a kind of mass phenomenon. Although, of course, and this strange universe we live in, where everything's is incredibly kind of exciting, and there's all kinds of things going on, and nothing changes, nothing happens. So that we have polls that consistently, 45-55, it's absolutely frozen in time. There's nothing seems to shift it.
That is another thing about Brexit, which I don't understand personally, because Brexit is definitely one of the things that could trigger another independence referendum. Probably the preeminent thing that could trigger another independence referendum. And yet you're looking for people out in the streets, you're looking at a sign of anger, looking for a sign of protest, in the way I suppose you look at Catalonia, and they know how to do a march.
Sorry to interrupt, but I think that is the issue, is people are now sick of more votes. People are sick of more referendums, and they don't want, I think the people who voted they voted against independence but wanted to stay in Europe, they don't want another vote. If people, I've heard that, is that there are people who, yes, they don't agree with leaving Europe, but they don't want another independence vote. I think if you were already pro-independence, you're ready for the other vote.
No, you want one tomorrow.
But exactly, because we live in two isolated parallel universes. And in one of the universes, which is occupied by 45% of us, of course, another vote tomorrow. Absolutely, good idea. It feels marvelous, and that'll give us our energy back and our optimism back, and we'll feel better about ourselves and all those kind of things. And that's great. 55% of the country, well, hell's bells, no. They just don't want it.
But you would have thought, and you did think at one time,
yes, we did.
People,
I thought,
who were upset at the European vote would then move and maybe have moved. Maybe they would move to a yes vote.
But there's also been a move the other way.
There might. Well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure about the move the other way. I think people who are pro-independence and would want to leave Europe, I'm not sure which one of those would prove to be the sort of dominant feeling when they come to another independence referendum. I think they would still vote yes. I do think that, but I don't know for sure.
But possibly this is the kind of logical culmination of the kind of anti-politics we've heard a lot about in the last little while. Is that actually is that people are scummed with it, and then what we have is this very strange situation where you have immovable blocks in Scottish politics, in British politics, that are maybe being caused by our binary referenda, first on Scottish independence and then on the European question, that we have these immovable blocks, and nothing, I mean nothing, can happen to shift opinion.
But something must happen at some stage, because you look at
sure?
it. I think I'm probably trying to convince myself. No, I do think there is a way of articulating this whole debate in a way that the penny will drop and people will say, right, okay, I'm unhappy, and I'm so unhappy, I'm going to
do something about
do
it.
something about
And
it.
that's the
What
issue.
that something about it is, I'm still not 100% sure.
I think as well there's a terror there as well when people have seen situations, be it Catalonia or even the Irish situation, where independence has caused so much upset that there's an awful lot of people think, oh, it's safer, it's easier to stay as we are, because we don't want that. We don't want it to be that bad.
Except now, it's not safer.
No.
It's potentially more dangerous to stay where we are.
But right now,
in this very second,
it's fine.
Yeah, it's different. I mean, do you think there's anything that would trigger this feeling?
Any one thing, I think that what really changed for me in the course of the 2014. I was never someone who thought we were going to get a yes vote. I never quite, I didn't quite buy that kettle of fish. But what did change was a sense of possibility, a sense of this is what positive change feels like. And there was a few months in the course of 2014 when you felt it, and it right across the board, not just in kind of political type circles or RT type circles, but everywhere. You felt a sense of real possibility of change, which you never felt, I don't think, well, certainly in Scotland, during the Brexit vote. You never felt that.
Never felt that. No.
And I don't think, from what I've heard anecdotally, that was ever felt in big Leave voting areas like in the north of England, or indeed in the Midlands. But I don't think that was ever felt. But that it's always struck me, and I suppose this is because I'm an old man now, but there have been various kind of points in my life, and points of during the miners' strike, for example, the poll tax, for example, some of the lead up, not the referendum itself, oddly enough, in 1997, but the lead up to that. There was a real feeling of possible change, of society reinventing itself. Yeah. Now, where that comes, I think what we've definitively proved is that it's not going to come from procedural questions about the European Union.
No.
That sense of possibility of change, and that's but again, it's something that those of us who are kind of political nerds are not necessarily terribly well equipped to spot coming.
No.
I think we could be the last people to ask.
But then the worst case that was made in the EU referendum, what came from the people who wanted to remain, and they said, I'm going to vote to remain, but I'm going to hold my nose while I'm doing it, and you think, well, that's inspiring. Great.
Yeah.
That's something that I really don't like, but it's very much the lesser of two evils.
Yeah. The only good, I'm always looking for the silver lining, I thought, to
Please
come
for you,
out of it
Good
all,
for you.
was that actually it's the most engaged I've seen people in politics in an awful long time.
Currently,
I think the whole referendum vote, even the Brexit vote, it lit a fire under young people. There's more debates. We'll talk about politics at home now, where we didn't beforehand. Me and my friends, we would discuss politics, but we wouldn't have beforehand. And I think there was a generation where you didn't really talk about politics. You voted your way. You didn't really even discuss who you voted. It was a private thing.
Yeah.
There was maybe my generation who did, whether it was modern studies in school, and it was deathly boring.
Yeah.
So we all I think got the
switched
well,
off,
we
right?
did. We switched off, and we didn't ever really engage. And then I think it's wonderful now that people are talking about this, and whether I'm not saying that I wouldn't have preferred that it had gone another way,
Yes.
but actually it's great that folk now are feeling that this is something I can discuss, this is something I can change and be involved with, and that's a positive. That
Yeah, no, definitely.
I'll take that. I'll take that with the sun shining. I'll take that.
No,
I think
definitely. But do you think there should be another EU referendum? Given that we know now lots of things that we didn't know at the time, mainly that we don't know what they're doing.
Oh,
If you get what I mean.
I mean, I never believed ever that we would leave in the first place.
Yeah.
I couldn't understand how that would even be a possibility.
Yeah.
But I think the difficult thing is we're not the ones you need to convince,
Yeah.
because if another referendum came up, we'd vote the same way, I'm guessing,
Yeah.
as we probably voted the first time.
Yeah, you
it's
probably
a
would.
different kettle of fish. Say if you're looking at the Midlands, you're looking at Northern England. I mean, the feeling there is alien to us. I remember going down to Birmingham just after the vote had gone through, and they were ecstatic.
Uh-huh.
The people I spoke to, and these were educated people who they understood politics, but the situation there they felt had got to the level it was so bad as it was working that it wasn't working. How it was all coming together wasn't working, so they voted for some form of change. And I think still for many people that's preferable.
And they would still want that.
They still want that. They want a
Yes.
difference. So even though so many lies were told, promises were broken, things have not gone the way it was expected, I think there's still, for many people, this idea of it's a change, it brings back the idea of what it is to be British, and that is very appealing for some.
Absolutely. No, I think you're right, I do think that there is, but I do think it's more existential than analytical. I think it's more emotional.
Yeah.
But emotion is a real thing. We can't despise it, because because in some ways, if you like, if the British national settlement of I think of what happened in 1945 to 48, to 51, that Labour government, as very much a British national moment, possibly the only one there's ever been, where there's a popular sense of Britishness, a popular sense of inclusion. Here we all are, we've all been through the Depression, we've all been through the war together, and by God, none of that's ever going to happen again. And then, and that creates a sense of Britishness. Then that sense of Britishness has been undermined by a great many things, only one of which is the European Union, and another of which is the decline of the welfare state, another which the idea of everyone caring for everybody else, that's gone. The full employment was abandoned as a notion to underline that welfare state. All those kind of things, all those happened, but Europe was part of it. But one thing I think we have to bear in mind in Scotland for the future, and I do think this to bring us back in a circle to the consent contempt clause that I was started with, is that part of one of the things that has gone wrong with Britishness is us. One of the things that's gone wrong with an inclusive sense of Britishness is Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland and devolution. So this is one of the things that needs to get fixed, and I think that's one of the things that's happening right now. Underneath the Brexit is emerging more and more, it seems to me, as an English national moment, and by God, if you can't complain about an English national moment if you're a Scottish nationalist, you can't complain about it. You can say, "Oh no, you're as entitled as everybody else is." But what it's happening to is it's coming through this to us bizarre prism, bizarre set of values, and we think, what is this imperial nostalgia? This craziness, but then again, it's not our country.
I could, and probably maybe will before the end of the programme, make an argument that there are things to be worried about England.
Sure.
But before that, we're going to have some music from Joy, and then after Joy's finished, we'll be talking about the Gaelic language plan, which was discussed in Scottish Parliament this week, and we'll find out what that entails and whether or not we should be particularly concerned about it. Joy.
Well, I thought to lighten the mood, we'd look at a lovely Gaelic song from Eriskay, and it's probably one of the most well-known Gaelic songs called the Eriskay Love Lilt. So this can soothe your soul. I should have a wee think of the next bit. Faith me of who will, faith me of who walk ye, faith me of who Smí a vránach stumi Shimmecha icheliuch suar Gaf mi koorst smil am him Gusandranik mishantach Fan rokerach gjalt mochdi Faith me of who Faith me of who he Faith me of who Smee favrans du gami Naum ri kromme gevische glaun Han ik snai meir mochri Von nach du god laf Dulken fakig du me Faith me of who Faith me of who ye Faith me of who Smee ha branach stumi Get nach ele sin je hast post Am in doch as gumbi At se vates mogagorn Chavi won orni Faith me of who Faith me of who he Faith me of who Smee favrans du gami
Thank you, Joy. Our souls are suitably soothed. Do you want to join us now and we can talk a bit about the Gaelic language plan, which I suppose exists or will exist to preserve the Gaelic language and to also preserve the tradition of handing down that language from one generation to another. It's not been overwhelmingly celebrated by the Gaelic community, I think. Some people think that it doesn't really judge the scale of the problem correctly, it underestimates the scale of the problem, and also that therefore it's not doing enough to actually make sure that that intergenerational handing down still continues because it's dying out. Is that an accurate portrayal of the arguments?
This is the third Gaelic language plan that's come out, and I actually see that as a really positive step. And I think what's interesting about this plan is, yes, it's looking at preservation, but actually it's more looking at the promotion and the development of the language, that it's used as an everyday language. You know, Gaelic is relevant. Normalisation of Gaelic language really, in my mind, the focus is that, yes, we're looking at this intergenerational passing from, you know, whether it be in families or communities and schools, but also we're creating new opportunities to learn, to use the language, and this is legislation that will hopefully support that. So I think it's quite difficult, especially when you're talking about anything, be it Gaelic or any other subject you choose. Parliamentary language is tough to understand if you're not involved in that. So when we're talking about a language plan, I think the disconnect comes in if it's the just normal person on the street, how does that affect me? How is it relevant to me? And that, to me, is the hardest thing to understand, is when you're seeing language that I actually think it is very simple compared to previous years. It's been looked at, how do we make this accessible to folk? It's hard to understand that, though, if you don't really understand how language plans work, if you don't know how language planning works, if you're just a Gael, you just speak, or you're just somebody who's interested in learning Gaelic, it's where the drip down is, how does this affect me? That's, I think, what the trickiest part is for folk to understand.
Because I think there's more people taking up the language or talking the language.
There are, yes.
But this intergenerational handing down of is, some people say, in danger of dying out.
Well, I mean, this is of course an area because Scotland is a divided country in that way. We have an English-speaking part of Scotland, or a Scots-speaking parts of Scotland, which and there is a degree of incomprehension. And I think, I mean, this is not necessarily me expressing myself, but it's something that you do come across, and that from the. If, as Joy says, we have to, how does this affect the everyday Gael on the street? How does this affect the everyday non-Gael on the street? And it's again, it is being, there has been a certain degree of stirring going on that by certain fringe elements of the unionist community, who are attempting, I think, partly in a I don't know exactly where it comes from in terms of their souls, but there's a kind of an attempt to build up antagonism, to use the Gaelic language as a stalking horse for the Scottish National Party, which, for anyone who knows the history of the Scottish National Party even a little, and the ideas of Scottishness, is bizarre. It's that you don't in a sense, one of the weaknesses historically of the Scottish National Party used to be that its lack of connection within the Gaeltacht. Yeah. This is perhaps a situation that's different, that's changing now. But in a sense, the kind of political expression of difference within tended to be, you voted for independents or voted for liberals, and out with either the Unionists or the Labour Party, or indeed the Scottish Nationalists, and so. There's a kind of strange disconnect going on. I think the positive thing about the Gaelic language plan and about a legislative consensus, actually, because this one, we mustn't forget that Unionists, sniping aside from some ultras, this went through the Scottish Parliament unanimously. This was not something that there were some contention around some details, but the idea of preservation of Gaelic and of the Gaelic identity and Gaelic culture as being in some way part of something, or at least valued, and meaning different things to different people, I suspect, but being valued is not really a that contentious a viewpoint. But at the same time, from me as a non-Gael, is exciting about this development and about this acts is a more complex, ambiguous idea of what Scottishness means. Because I think Scottishness has always meant something rather different to the Gaels than it's meant to English-speaking Scots. And I think that this is has historical roots that go back beyond the Jacobites and the Whigs, let alone anybody else. So, yeah.
I also think there's a really romantic notion of Gaelic must be passed down through families from one generation to another generation. But Gaels were persecuted for speaking their own language.
Sure.
So although we would love it if it was being passed down, there are generations who are still alive who were told, you should not be speaking your language is of the poor, your language is of the uneducated, you would do better to your children by teaching them English. And then we're turning around and saying, oh, actually, it's your fault that Gaelic is dying out because you're not talking Gaelic to your children. Well, they've been told for years that not to do that. Yeah. So it's a very romantic idea that the only place for this to happen is in the home. Yes, it's so important that Gaelic is in the home and Gaelic is in the community without a doubt. But we're coming at this from, unfortunately, not this utopian society where everybody speaks Gaelic. We're coming in at it from the bottom, really, going, how do we create new speakers? How do we support the people who are there? How do we legislate to make sure we have the power to do so?
And Gaelic schools are becoming increasingly popular.
Very popular, and I think that's a wonderful step. I'm a fluent speaker, but I'm not a native speaker. Right. My mum and dad didn't speak Gaelic. Okay. My grandparents would have. We'd Irish Gaelic in our family, we'd Scottish Gaelic in our family, but this again was the generation where they weren't encouraged to speak Gaelic to the family, so it was lost. So for me, I had to learn as an adult, and it's so much harder to learn Gaelic, even if you're doing it as a degree or you're doing like that. You look at these Gaelic schools where you walk in and children are picking up language in the same way as they're picking up math skills or science. They're just learning, they're like wee sponges. Yeah. And I think that's wonderful. And I was genuinely horrified to see some of the really anti-Gaelic rhetoric that was appearing online and in the newspapers. Because for me, I don't care what language you're learning, being bilingual is been proved so many times. That's an advantage to children. And I just cannot understand how people wouldn't see that as an advantage.
What for you does Gaelic bring to Scotland? Not just to, in fact, probably specifically not to those that speak it, to those that don't speak it.
I think in some ways it's more important. To me, it's a cultural identity. I grew up I'm from up near Oban originally, and I grew up in an area that was very Gaelic, very Highland, but I didn't speak Gaelic. And there was the sort of nosy side of me that I heard people speaking Gaelic, and I always thought they sounded like they were speaking about really exciting things.
Yes. Or maybe they're talking about you.
Probably.
Yeah.
But I loved the idea of that. But actually, what's been really nice for me is place names. I can understand the place names. Or that we have so many just, I guess they're kind of colloquialisms in English that have come from Gaelic. Even word order, when you start to look at Scottish speech, quite a lot of it is a direct translation for Gaelic. It maybe doesn't make 100% sense, but it's the way the Gaelic phrasing was. It's the music, it's the language, it's the people. And that's, to me, what's interesting. It's cultural identity, and it's what makes us special. Yeah. And I think in Scotland, we're not very good at standing up for ourselves in that way and saying, yes, we're different, we have something that nobody else has. And I think that's amazing. We've got a language, we've got a culture that's real. It's not just tartan, it's not just playing the pipes, although these are very important things, but actually we've got a language that's thriving. And if you go to a Gaelic school, you see that. You see children growing up and they're playing, they're learning in Gaelic. And I think that's wonderful. But it needs to be there for everybody. It needs to be for the botach that's on the croft that speaks Gaelic. It needs to be for the urban Gael. It needs to be for the wider community, the ones that are learning out with Scotland. I think it's really important that we are looking and including everybody in that.
So when you're building, you mentioned, Peter, when you were talking about the 2014 feelings of reinventing the country, reinventing the culture. Is Gaelic a key part of that reinvention
I think it is, because I think what I look forward to is a more complex idea of Scottishness. Because I think identities, we tend to shoehorn each other into one identity at a time, but actually the richest human life is when you've got several, when you have several affiliations. And several things that you share, things that you don't share, and that basically, if I don't share Gaelic with Joy, but I'm very glad that she's got that, partly for singing, but also partly because that enriches my identity as a non-Gael, because it associates me with a whole other linguistic, musical, visual culture, which I can embrace. So I think it's important for all of us.
Is this utopianism to suggest that the fact that Scottish nationalism or even sort of Scottish culture and Scottish identity has got different strands to it makes it different from English nationalism?
No, I don't think it does make it different. I think it makes it the same, actually. I think it makes it the same as... my favourite thing on identity actually comes from Lebanon, which is a writer called Amin Malouf. He writes in French. He's an Arab. He's a Christian. He's a Protestant. He's a Protestant French-speaking Christian who's educated in Beirut. And he talks about all these strands of identity. These are all, as far as he's concerned, brother and sisterhoods, fraternity, the things that he's part of. Everyone who writes in French is his brother and sister. Everyone who writes is his brother or sister. Everyone who's an Arab is his brother or sister. But the thing is that these identities don't mutually exclude each other. And he actually defines oppression as being forced to choose one identity over all the others. Yeah. So it seems to me that our Scottishness, our Europeanness, our human citizenship of the world, that's where the richness of our new experience of the world should be. And in a sense, what for me, as a yes voter, it was liberation from a dead hand of identity that was being imposed on me.
Yeah.
That I felt I wanted to get past and so for me, being complex and agile and listening to Gaelic songs can all be part of it.
Mm.
But I would like also that we embrace the wider idea of Scottishness, that we did more for Scots, that we did more for Doric, that we did more for Gaelic.
Sure.
Like I
Sure.
think we should be looking at what makes us special. And what I think is really lovely about Glasgow is it's so multicultural.
Yeah.
And I remember going into a primary school to do Gaelic singing with a group of, I think, primary 2, primary 3, and I said, so who here speaks another language? And there were 13 different languages spoken in that class, and not one of them went, well, actually, I speak X language, so I can't do Gaelic. They were open.
Sure.
Children are open to learning, and I thought it was wonderful that they had different cultures, they had different understanding. There was a wee boy that sat on my feet. He was so close to me, and everything I said, he was like, Miss Gaelic lady, Miss Gaelic lady. This is how we say that in my language. So he was already relating what he knew at home, which was different, to what he was doing in school, which was in English, and to Gaelic. And there was enough space. There was never a time that a child has gone, I can't do this because this isn't part of me. This isn't my language. They just accept it, and I think we need to open our minds a wee bit more and say, well, just because you're not a Gaelic speaker doesn't mean that there's no worth in Gaelic.
No.
Just because you aren't interested doesn't mean there's no worth. I'm not interested in a lot of things, but I'm never going to stop somebody else being interested in that.
I just wonder if the fact that our languages within Scotland or something makes us more open, this is maybe a leap of faith, makes us more open to things like immigration. Because, I mean, we've just had this controversy over the Windrush generation in England, and which seems to me, we asked generations of people to come to this country. Well, we didn't, but they were asked to come to this country, and then when they came, now they're pretty much being told, well, we don't want you here, and you would want to dissociate yourself from anything like that, and you would think, well, why, if Scotland had its own immigration policy, would that make a difference?
I think I might make the case now. I think that might be true now. I think had you asked a Glasgow Irish Catholic in 1925 that same question, they'd have gone, are you out of your mind? I think that things change, that things evolve. I think that countries evolve, and that part of our evolution, I hope, is that openness. And it may well be that in this context, something like, and again, so even the language is a celebration of Gaelicness, and as opposed to toleration of Gaelicness, and again, toleration of difference, toleration of immigrants, but no, celebration of what people positively bring. And celebration that they're interested in us as well, but that's, it seems to me that there is a genuine sense of possibility, but I think it's historically specific. We have to look at things can turn round awfully fast.
And it's possibly worth admitting that the only people that don't appreciate and understand the power of language and culture in Scotland are Scots. If you go anywhere else, they are thrilled. If I go to sing in Canada or America or Europe, it doesn't matter where I go, nobody has ever turned around and said, well, actually, can you sing in English for us? That's happened in Scotland.
Is it?
Yeah.
Really?
In terms
Yes.
Oh God.
in terms of Gaelic music and its place in in world music, is there a growing sort of understanding that this music is just as important as any other traditional forms of music from other countries, because I suppose Celtic Connections now places it in the context of American soul music and reggae and other world musics, and it's taking its place among them.
Yeah, and I think that's really cheered me because, Celtic Connections is wonderful, and that type of festival, there's a Celtic festival in Barbados. You can go anywhere in the world now, and I think people are understanding that Celtic music is part of world music, and that's always been there for Irish music. The Irish in general, they emigrated, and wherever they went, they started up their own little corner of Irishness, be it an Irish pub or Irish music, or I mean, you can't go anywhere in the globe practically without looking round and there's an Irish pub in a corner here. Scotland's never done that. We've never quite been strong enough, I think. But what is wonderful now, I see a total difference from, say, when I was in school and I did traditional music and I sang in Gaelic, and there was maybe about 4 of us that did that at secondary level. We were this wee group who loved what we did, but it wasn't really that cool.
No.
It wasn't that wide. Now you
wouldn't
go.
have thought ever there would be a festival.
But even like pipe bands are cool now. You go to somewhere and you see the youngsters who are like, I want to learn drumming, I want to learn piping. You look at young bands that are going to the garage in Glasgow and selling out the garage singing in Gaelic, or you're going to Celtic Connections, which is not just picking the nice venues where we're going to put people in the nice venues. I mean, they're everywhere now, and I think that's really important. It's normalisation. For me, that's like the issue of language and culture, is that it just becomes the normal thing. And I love that. I get really cheered. I was walking up Dumbarton Road recently, and I suddenly realised I was nearly stalking this poor couple that were in front of me because they were speaking in Gaelic, and I was getting closer because I wanted to hear what they were saying. But I was so excited that in Glasgow, that this was just somebody talking normally. Which was exciting, but also slightly depressing, that it's not quite there yet.
Yeah.
But we're taking the steps. We're definitely taking the steps.
Although I think the most depressing thing this week for me about about Scottish culture and matters associated was we got blamed for Donald Trump. Did you see that? It was the Scottish part of his the Scottish part of his nature, which makes him so abrasive.
Who said this?
I can't remember.
Girls have had to put up with this for a while.
Well, no, absolutely. I don't know, Lewis. You know, that I'll never live it down. But then but then Trump, in a way, he does, in some ways, bring an awful lot of this discussion together in terms of the anti-politics. I mean, the other night was it last night or the night before? There's a very I suppose quite cosy annual event called the White House Correspondents' Dinner, which is held every year at this time, and presidents and the high hegians of politics and journalism get together in a room and have a wee laugh at the game. But Trump has refused to go. And Trump went, instead of being in Washington D.C., was in Washington, Michigan. That night, to say, basically to deliberately snub his nose. And of course, the thing is that actually, there is something smug about some events like the Washington Correspondents' Dinner, which is worth snubbing your nose at. And again, I think that this is because it absolutely strikes a chord. We have to again bear in mind that just like in Scotland, we have these immovable lumps of unionism and and nationalism. In America, there's a fantastic piece by Jay Rosen I read in the New York Review of Books, where he's talking about. Journalists in America now have to wake up in the morning and realise that for a third of the country, nothing they say is ever, ever, ever going to matter. Yeah. That it doesn't matter what they or the law or human reason itself says about Donald Trump. It doesn't matter because he's going to get away with it anyway, as far as that third is concerned. And they love him. They genuinely love him.
Has the Trump presidency lived up to your expectations?
No, it's so depressing. But I mean, it's really easy to laugh about it, and I think you have to cope with humour, but it's terrifying at the same time. And I really do not like, it makes me feel very, very uncomfortable, the latent racism and sexism and discrimination that's now just accepted because of it's
you were talking about normalising Gaelic, normalising appalling behaviour.
To me, that's the danger with somebody like that being in such a prominent post, is that feelings that maybe were kept under wraps because they weren't palatable beforehand. Now he's going, this is great, look at this, we can be our own people, we can get our chance now to say what we feel. And actually I think they're very, very dangerous expressions that he's come out with. I don't like at all.
When you mentioned the sort of press, the White House press event, I mean, his challenge to the media is really huge, because I watched, I think it was yesterday, an interview he gave to a Fox News programme where he just talked. He wouldn't let them ask any questions. It was talked until they eventually had to just say, well, you're clearly a very busy man.
You're clearly not a busy man.
Maybe you could go back to running the country. Anyway, I mean, I think everything he branded fake news
Yes.
Which in itself is a kind of double bluff, because he calls everything fake.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
I don't. And how can you distinguish then between what's real and what's not real? If it's becoming a very difficult maze to negotiate.
Well, I think, as Joy was saying, this is a normalization of that the man will he lies like he breathes, and again it doesn't seem to matter. So so the if you like, the entire liberal establishment, which includes legal process, for God's sake, is wrong-footed by this, and in a way you do feel, God, this is what the 1930s must have felt like. This is what the world that Bertolt Brecht has a little epigram that he used that he was asked to explain Nazism, and he said they grew tired of thought, and that people are tired of the political process. They're tired of newspapers. They're tired of people talking at them. They're tired of voting. Oh, just let him handle it for a bit.
But there's also, like, I remember, I'm not that old, I remember there was a time that if a politician was caught out lying,
They would have to resign.
yes. And now it's just accepted that lies are okay. And if you're found out, don't worry about it. And because nobody's been held to account, it's like teaching children. You're trying to teach children that your actions have consequences. And then you're looking in politics, and think, these are the people that are supposed to be leading the country. These are the people that are supposed to be in charge, setting a good example. And they're lying out their back teeth, and there's never, ever anything happening about that. Oh, we lied, but
there's
they're worse.
consequences. 'Cause
No.
he's got a regime where you're able to just sack people.
Yeah.
I mean really key
It's
people, you
terrifying.
sack them and then they're gone, and then take any legal action against the former.
But I wonder how I do wonder how much of this is part of a wider cultural phenomenon in I suppose what you might loosely call Western culture. But there is this feeling of both excitement, because Trump again has animated, the opposition to Trump is enormously energetic and inventive and wonderfully funny. I mean, if you've ever I would seriously recommend catching Stephen Colbert's Late Show. His monologues, they're fantastic. But again, he's talking to 1/3 of the country, the 1/3 of the country who hate Trump, and he's very funny and acerbic and marvelous, and it's just. And it's very exciting, but nothing seems to shift. So, I mean, maybe this is just me, but this is where I find myself more and more these days. Is seeing what looks like an enormous dynamic of things happening, and at the same time, just this kind of slippage towards something, towards we don't know what.
Yeah. Well, if we have grown tired of thought, thankfully we have not grown tired of music.
Yeah.
Nice segue there.
Very good.
So, thank you. So we're going to close the show with some music from Joy. It just remains for me to say thank you very much to both my guests this morning. I hope you enjoyed the show. Joy.
Van geur malan en gultrum gadgetjelum mega onze. 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 Gadgetjelum khalwavelum gadgetjelum mega onze. Gadgetjelum khalwavelum gadgetjelum mega onze. Gadgetjelum Hallovelum, gadgetjelum, mega onze. Van Germaland en Gulderum, 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 gadgetjelum, mega onze. Gadgetjelum, Hallovelum, gadgetjelum, mega onze, gadgetjelum, Hallovelum, gadgetjelum, mega onze, gadgetjelum, Hallovelum, gadgetjelum, mega onze, van Germaland en Gulderum, gadgetjelum, mega onze. Jult wat toch vatteras, kun jult wat toch via, jult wat toch vattera, grin van Mali hazard, jult wat toch vatteras, kun jult wat toch via, jult wat toch vattera, grin van Mali hazard, jult wat toch vatteras, kun jult wat toch via, jult wat toch vatteras, kun jult wat toch via, jult wat toch vatteras, kun jult wat toch via, jult wat toch luchacher, as een dal via, jult wat toch fattegas, jut wat toch via, jut wat toch fattegas, grin van Mali Hazard, jut wat toch fattegas, jut wat toch via, jut wat toch fattegas, grin van Mali Hazard, jut wat toch fattegas, jut wat toch via, jut wat toch fattegas, jut wat toch via, jut wat toch fattegas, jut wat toch via, jut wat toch futjager, as een tafia, Nambega cum gipo botte vocina sanalta, Nambega cum gipo botte vocina sanalta, Nambega cum gipo botte vocina sanalta, Vega one verina se vocina down, Vocinias gan vocina sanalta, Vocinias gan vocina sanalta, Vocinias gan vocina sanalta, Smervega one verina se vocina down, Nambega cum gipo botte vocina sanalta, Nambega cum gipo botte vocina sanalta, Nambega cum gipo botte vocina sanalta, Smervega one verina se vocina down, Vocinias gan vocina sanalta, Vocinias gan vocina sanalta, Vocinias gan vocina sanalta, Smervega one verina se vocina down.